lagging behind.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned New Zealand. Do you want to share that story?
Yeah, Phil Geertsen here in Idaho, he was the owner of Geertsen Seeds, and his business was built on alfalfa. And alfalfa is the first perennial seed that was genetically modified. And it was approved, and then they pulled the approval back, saying that they didn't do adequate environmental impact studies, and then they were able to just get it approved again recently. But when the GMO gene turned up in his conventional alfalfa seeds, he lost his whole seed export business with New Zealand, because New Zealand has a zero tolerance policy on GMOs. So I've heard that our agencies have stopped tracking exports as of 2008, I think is what I read. But here, for sure, locally, we've had an impact. GMOs have reduced our export business, certainly
Well,
here
yeah,
locally.
and that individual in particular probably lost, most of his business.
His entire
business.
export
And so
side.
the cross-contamination, was that there was GMO alfalfa close by?
It doesn't even have to be particularly close by, and that's one thing that the industry will say, well, they've got these built-in requirements, and you have to have certain barriers, and you have to plant a certain distance, and they say that they've thought of all this. All that's required is a truck carrying bags of seed to go by, one have a hole in it, and you've got cross-contamination. Birds, bees, they all carry this pollen. And the interesting thing about alfalfa being the first perennial seed is it reseeds itself, and it spreads feral. It goes out into the wild. And so after he lost his seed export business, he funded a study himself, and he went out and he tested 10 different sites, spanning 6 different, from the east side of Oregon into Idaho in different counties, and 9 out of 10 feral alfalfa samples came back positive for that GMO seed. So once it's out there, and it contaminates the conventional seed, and really the feeling is that alfalfa is lost. Native alfalfa is lost.
Yeah. You were mentioning the problem with you can't recall something that's out there in nature, and you mentioned salmon. Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Well, Aqua Bounty has introduced the first genetically modified animal, which is salmon. And they started doing field trials and studies, and they promised that during these studies that the salmon would be sterile, so that it couldn't escape and reproduce in the wild. But actually, was it just last year? The USDA gave Aqua Bounty a grant of $500,000 to research how they could make the salmon sterile. It was not sterile. They've been doing these studies, and
so there were genetically modified salmon out there, potentially.
Who knows if they escaped?
Okay.
But if they were able to reproduce, then that is a possibility. If they do escape, that gene is now caught in the wild, and how do you recall a genetically modified salmon? You don't. And it's the same thing with, Jenny was saying, with alfalfa. Essentially, it's ruined, because once that gene is released, there's no going back. We grow a lot of sugar beets in Idaho, and there was a ban put on sugar beets in 2010, and the ban was lifted because farmers could not find conventional sugar beet seed. And it's because all sugar beets are now GMO. We're losing the biodiversity of these seed varieties, and farmers are becoming dependent on this one source for seed.
Yeah, and built into a lot of the seed by the industry, isn't it? They're sterile.
They self-terminate.
They
Yeah,
self-terminate. That's the suicide gene, I think, is what it's been called.
Yeah,
Okay.
and they self-terminate, and that's to help ensure that farmers won't save their seed and replant them the following year, because it is illegal to do that. And Monsanto and others in the industry will sue farmers for saving genetically modified seed even if they didn't plant genetically modified seed to begin with. There's a famous case with Percy Schmeiser, who's a canola farmer, and he was a conventional canola farmer, but his fields got contaminated with genetically modified seed. He knew he saved the seed because his business was built on him saving his own seed, so he saved it to the following year, and Monsanto sued him. And he had to mortgage his farm. He lost everything to fight them. He ended up losing the case because he did save the seed, and it did contain this patented gene that belongs to Monsanto. And so a precedence was set there that Monsanto gets to basically own this form of life because it contains their gene. And but what was interesting is later, when his fields got contaminated again, he sued Monsanto for $650 for the cleanup costs of cleaning up the GMO gene out of his fields. And Monsanto tried to settle with him with a gag order.
Oh, what, you said $650?
$650.
Yeah. That was it. I didn't know if
that
I
was
misheard
it.
you
No,
or you
$650.
Okay.
And they tried to settle with a gag order, and he refused, and he fought it. I think it took 2 years to fight the court battle. He ended up winning that one, but he won it without the gag order. So he's able to talk about his case, and he now travels all over the world talking to farmers about the dangers of getting involved in genetically modified organisms and the trap that it can sometimes get farmers into.
Yeah, I'm not sure which documentary it was. I have seen some personal stories of people being sued for trading seeds, for saving seeds, and things like that. That is part of the history of being a farmer.
Right.
You know, that goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. You always save your seed, you trade them, you know, it's part of the culture.
Right.
It's part of how it's done.
Right.
So.
And it's the truly sustainable way to grow food, because if you can't save and replant, that's not sustainable.
No.
If you're dependent on one company, or just even a handful of companies for all of our food, that's not sustainable.
So it's almost like that they can't fail, because if they fail, then where are we going to get our food next year?
That too big to fail in our food supply is very unsettling.
Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah.
So.
And not only that, but monocultures in themselves are not very sustainable. I like to bring up the potato famine in Ireland. You know, when you're planting just one variety and this variety gets diseased, I mean, it's over.
Yeah.
So big ag in itself, I think, is heading, has been heading and is in the wrong direction when it comes to, and they claim to be sustainable. On their website, when, you know, Monsanto, when they give conventions and talk, that's part of their lingo is sustainable farming, and it's not.
No. And it's amazing, actually. I've seen some of the varieties, you know, of the old, like, heirloom tomatoes and different potatoes and different corn, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I never knew. You know?
Yeah. And it's
we're
really
so used to seeing it looking one way.
Right.
You know,
and it's really frustrating when you know this, when you know those other varieties exist, to drive. For me, I live out in the country, and so when I drive into the grocery store, and I pass field after field after field of these corn and sugar beets and everything, and I get to the grocery store and I can buy tomatoes from Mexico, and I can buy, you know, melons from Mexico or all these different countries, but we're not really producing our own food anymore as a culture.
I'm just happy to say I'm optimistic, because I'm seeing a huge shift in the mindset of a lot of people, especially in this valley. And a lot of community farms, a lot of people growing their own food, and I feel like, okay, they get it and they're doing something about it, which is really cool.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is a big focus for us. And when inevitably, after we've talked to people about GMOs and what they are, the next question is, how do I avoid eating them?
Yeah.
And so we really push eating local. Getting to know your farmer. The first thing I did after I found out about it is I found a local source for my meat and my eggs and my milk, where you can go and meet the farmer that's producing your food, and you know that they feed the same food to their own families. And you're right, there's such a huge culture developing here of local eating, and so we really push that eating local options. In fact, on our website we have a list of local food co-ops and farms and CSAs.
Wonderful. So what is your web address? Go ahead and share it so everybody knows.
It's GMOFreeIdaho.com.
GMOFreeIdaho.com.
Right.
And we're also on Facebook.
Okay. Well, I liked you on Facebook today.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we you can also avoid it by eating local. I mean, by eating organic.
Yeah.
Organic is supposed to be GMO free,
Okay.
and so that's another way to avoid it.
And it's interesting, they do label when they are GMO free, so you're not going to see it labeled that it is GMO, but
Right.
you know, watch for the GMO free.
There is voluntary labeling
Yes.
that manufacturers can do to say that they're GMO free.
Okay. Yeah. And so anything else that maybe you want to say? We have just a few minutes left.
You know, we're always involved in community activities, community events.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to raise awareness. Our goal is to get a ballot initiative going for labeling laws in the state of Idaho next year.
Okay.
And actually, we're meeting with Senator Mike Crapo's office on Monday to present comments from people in the Treasure Valley who want to see genetically modified foods labeled. And so we'll be having ongoing contact with our legislators throughout the next year, and we're definitely going to need to rally the troops and get people to help us out to gather signatures and to get that option on our ballot so we can vote. Because no matter what you believe about GMOs or about Monsanto or whatever, the majority of consumers agree that we have a right to know what's in our food.
Yeah.
And they really should be labeled. And so that's our biggest goal. And in the meantime, we're just trying to let people know.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for all the work that you're doing around this issue. I know it's just because you feel it in your heart that you want to make a difference in the world, and you want to make the world a better place for yourselves and for your family and for everyone here. So thank you for being the treasure that you are,
Yeah.
and I really appreciate you being here with me today.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Thank you.